everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlene, and today I'm going to be talking about my plans, or lack thereof, for the Distant Lands book club for 2026. If you saw my last video where I was ranking all of the Jane Austen novels, then you will know that I'm making some changes with the book club for 2026. Namely in the fact that the book club is going to be on a bit of a hiatus. I am going to take the year of 2026 off from doing the book club itself. I don't know for sure when we'll go back to the book club just being a book club, but unfortunately last year I had a lot of books every month, usually at least 3 a month, that I had to read in that particular month for different things, and I'm kind of just needing a break from that for next year. So that's part of the reason why I'm putting this on hold for now. The other reason is that I was doing live streams every month in order to discuss the books with you guys, but unfortunately at the age that my kids are, doing live streams is not very easy to organize, and especially trying to do them at a time when most people would be able to attend, which tends to be in the evenings, which means I need to do it at a time either when my kids are still up, which would not be ideal because I'd have to do it back in my bedroom, or what I was doing, which is trying to start the live stream right after my kids go to bed. So that way it's not too late for you guys, but I can't really do it any earlier because the kids are up, and trying to do it back in my bedroom and hope the kids don't bother me is not really ideal either. So, hopefully as the kids get older, doing live streams won't be as big of a deal, or maybe I'll figure out a different time when that works better. But with everything I've got going on right now, and if you want a little bit of an idea of that, you can go back and watch the Jane Austen video, because that's where I kind of gave a rundown of where I've been, why I've been gone, and why I'm still gone. But with everything we do have going on right now, I just don't have the time to try to figure out when I can make the live streams work and how to organize it, other times that might work, how we can make it work, or any of those kinds of things. So until I actually have the time to be able to focus on that, I'm just going to have to say we're going to take the year off and we're not going to have the book club next year. Now, if that was all that I had to say, this would be an extremely short video. But I decided, instead of doing the book club next year, instead what I would like to do is a reading challenge. And I know a lot of people do reading challenges where, January you read a book that fits this prompt, February this prompt, and so on. However, I already participate in a couple of those. And again, this starts to get into the I have to read X amount of books every single month. And I'm trying to avoid that. So what I did instead is I created a bingo board. And so I will pop an image of the graphic up here. The book club was just called Distant Lands Book Club, but for this I titled it Travel to Distant Lands, and it's the 2026 Reading Challenge. And so every space on the bingo board is related to some subgenre of either fantasy or sci-fi. There is a free space in the middle. You do not have to read a book to fit that free space. But all of the other spaces you will have to read a book to fit them. And each book can only count towards one space, because this is a year-long reading challenge. So we're not covering up multiple spaces with the same book. So the way that I'm setting this up to work is you will fill this out throughout the year of 2026. And I will be doing a giveaway with this for a $50 Amazon gift card. So for every bingo that you complete, so every full row, full column, or full diagonal that you complete, you get 1 entry into the giveaway. If you get a blackout, you get the 12 automatic entries plus an additional entry for the fact that you got a blackout. So you can get up to 13 entries into the giveaway, and then probably at the beginning of January in 2027, to make sure everyone has time to get all of their entries in, I will randomly choose one person who will get a $50 gift card. Now, couple of stipulations. One, this is US dollars. So whatever the equivalent to $50 US would be in your currency, that is what you would receive if you don't live in the States. Because it's an Amazon gift card, that means anyone who is able to receive an Amazon gift card digitally is eligible to win this giveaway. So it is open to people outside of the United States as long as you can digitally receive a gift card. And for submissions, I'm creating a Google Forms for you to put in your entries. You will have to include your email address because I have to know where to send the gift card. Also your name and the country you live in because there is going to be an exchange rate there. Each time you get a bingo, you're basically going to go through the form and it's going to ask you to list out the space you filled in for that bingo. So you're going to list out 5 spaces and 5 books. If one of the spaces is the free space, you can just put the N/A for not applicable for which book did you read, because it's going to ask you the book you read for each prompt as well. Mostly so I can make sure that it actually fits the prompt, because these are specific to the subgenre, so it does have to actually fit. And honestly, books could count for multiple spaces, so you just have to decide which space they're going to go on. But you will list out all 5 books that you completed for that bingo and which prompt they filled in. And then even if it's one that you filled in before, you're going to have to fill it in again if you got a bingo covering the same spot. So yeah, when you get your blackout, you're going to be filling in a lot of I did this already. But unfortunately, that's the way it goes sometimes. And I will have a link to the graphic down in the description below. So if you want to download that or print it out or use it to post on Instagram or YouTube or wherever, you can feel free to go ahead and download that at any time. But the Google form, I will not link down in the description until January 1st. So you're not going to be able to submit before January because this challenge starts on January 1st. And also I will probably also put up a community post with the link as well. So if you don't remember to come back to this video and get that, you can get it from the community post. All right, so I think that covers the basics of how this is going to work. So now, just for clarity's sake, I'm going to go through each of the spaces on the bingo board and go over what they each say and what type of book that means that you will need to read. A lot of these you may know what they actually mean, but this way, in case anybody is unsure about any space, this will hopefully clear that up. All right, so we're just going to start at the top left on the board and go straight across and then down a row, straight across, and so on. So the very first square on the board is historical fantasy. I think this one is probably fairly self-explanatory just by the name, but this is a book that takes place in a historical time period, but there's something fantastical about it. An example of this would be the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, which takes place during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, so late 17, early 1800s, but in this version of history, there are dragons. So the dragons do play a role in this story, and that is a type of historical fantasy. The next square is culture-inspired fantasy, and so this could be an Asian-inspired fantasy, Latino-inspired fantasy, African-inspired, anything like that. It could be inspired by an ancient culture, so it could be inspired by ancient Egypt. The main thing is that it is a fantasy that's inspired by a specific culture. Now, could you say like medieval fantasy is inspired by medieval England? Yes, but medieval fantasy is on here. So we're kind of going with cultures outside of your own and outside of, I guess, anything that would be kind of similar to your own. So like if you're American, outside of American culture, probably outside of Canadian and British culture, and even Australian culture, because they're all fairly similar. Unless it's based on the culture of like a native tribe or something, then that would be one thing. But if it's based more on the current culture of those countries, not really going to count for this. All right, the next square is a magic school. And again, kind of self-explanatory. It's a school where students go and maybe they learn magic, or magic is just part of it. Like the people who attend there use magic even if they're not studying magic. Or magic is one of the things that they're learning about, but they also learn about other things. Basically, if it's a school where kids can do magic and possibly study magic, that will count. One that immediately comes to mind is Babel or Babel, whichever way it's pronounced. I want to say that's by R.F. Kuang. If I have the wrong name, I apologize. That one is a fantasy book that takes place at a school, although I think that one takes place in Oxford now that I think about it. But I think it's also historical, so it would probably still count. A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik would also be an example of this. The next square is dragons. So any book that has dragons. That's all it has to have. The Hobbit would count for this one with Smaug. Again, Temeraire would count because there are dragons in that historical fantasy, so as long as there's dragons in it somewhere, that one counts. And then the last square in the top row is time travel. So any book that involves any kind of time travel. Manga-wise, sometimes random things come to mind for me, but the first one that comes to mind for me is the Orange series by Ichigo Takano. This is a manga series, and the premise of the book is that the main character's future self is writing to her in the past in order to try to change the future of one of her friends and prevent something bad from happening to him. So that is a form of time travel, even though it's only the letters traveling in time. But it is still a form of time travel. But then obviously any book where a character is traveling through time would count. And yes, before anyone asks, because I know this series is super popular, yes, I would count the Gabriel Meyer series. Why can't I think of what the series is called? I don't know, I just blanked. But that series would count. I know you guys know which one I'm thinking of. Then going down a row, the first square is Christian fantasy. So any book that is marketed as a Christian fiction book that is fantasy will count for this one. It's December right now, and I just read the book, so it comes to mind first. But A Soul as Cold as Frost by Jennifer Krepf. I know it's not the way I think it would be pronounced, because I just listened to the audiobook of this one, but I can't remember how it's pronounced now. But she is a Christian author. The book is a Christian allegory, so that one would count. Then the next square is steampunk. So this is a sci-fi genre. And when I did the Distant Lands book club, we had more fantasy books than sci-fi because I tend to read more fantasy than sci-fi. So there are more fantasy squares on the board than there are sci-fi squares. The simplest way to describe steampunk is that the society is based on Victorian England, but things basically run in a way that they might have if steam had become the main material used for powering things rather than electricity. So electricity is what we actually use to power things, but if steam had continued to be used for more and more things, what the world might have looked like. So you tend to see a lot of clockwork things when it comes to steampunk. It could be futuristic and just kind of look that way. It could be set more in what feels like Victorian England, just have more of that steam-powered clockwork feel to it. But that's generally what steampunk is. I believe, just from looking at the cover, I believe Secrets in the Mist by Morgan L. Bussey is steampunk. Also, Illusionarium by Heather Dixon is steampunk. Just to throw a couple YA ones out there. I know there's other steampunk books out there. They're just the first ones that come to mind. And because I'm probably going to say that a lot, we're just going to sum it up with whatever books I recommend are just the first ones that come to mind. I did not plan these out. So I'm just going to cover my bases there. All right, the next square is post-apocalyptic. So this is typically going to be sci-fi as well. But this is a book that takes place immediately following some kind of apocalypse, some kind of catastrophic event that basically destroys the world as we know it and causes people to have to live completely different lives. It could take place immediately after. I'm trying to remember for sure because it's been several years since I read it, but I believe The Passage by Justin Cronin would count as post-apocalyptic. The beginning part of the book takes place before the apocalyptic event, and then the latter part of the book takes place after. So that one I'm pretty sure would count. It could also be something that takes place long after an apocalypse, but the world looks very different because this is society as it has grown out of that apocalypse. So things like The Giver by Lois Lowry would count for that. Okay, the next category is a fantasy retelling. So this is any kind of fantasy book that is a retelling of some type of story. It could be a retelling of a fairy tale. It could be a retelling of a Greek myth. It could be a retelling of a classic. Anything like that would count. So like The Forgotten Book by Mechtel Glezer. It does take place in Germany in modern times, but there are fantasy elements to it. It is a more gothic-toned retelling of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, but it takes place at a boarding school in Germany. As far as Greek myth retellings, Percy Jackson is a perfect example of that. Also, things like Circe or Song of Achilles or Ariadne, Those are all Greek myth retellings. As far as fairy tale retellings, you have, apparently I keep going back to Naomi Novik, I just realized, but Uprooted and Spinning Silver are both fairy tale retellings. Uprooted is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and Spinning Silver is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, and I believe also takes inspiration from at least Jewish mythology, if not also Russian mythology. I haven't finished that book, so I can't say for sure, but that's my understanding. All right, and the last square in this row is Sword and Sorcery. So this is fantasy that is mostly focused on fighting with swords and magic. That's the simplest way to describe it. Okay, I was thinking this was an example, but I couldn't remember if it was or not. Conan the Barbarian is a good example of this. So in general, Sword and Sorcery is going to be books that are like heroes and monsters and all of those. That's the main thing that it's going to focus on. Then going down to the middle row, the first box is Wintry Fantasy. And again, A Soul as Cold as Frost would also count for this one. It's very much a Christmassy retelling. You've got a fantasy version of Santa Claus and the Snow Queen and all of that takes place in its own world. It is very much a wintry fantasy. All right, next we have the one that I already kind of mentioned, and that's medieval fantasy. So this is any kind of fantasy inspired by a lot of the things from medieval England. So things like Lord of the Rings would count for this one. I would say The Legend of the First Empire, which begins with Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. That one I feel like would also count for this. So this is a very common genre in fantasy. It's what a lot of fantasy was based on for a very long time. So finding medieval fantasy is really not very difficult. Finding ones that you actually enjoy, that might be more difficult, especially if you're kind of burnt out on it or it's not really your thing. But they are generally pretty easy to find. All right, then we have the free space, which again, you don't actually have to read a book for. If you want to read a random fantasy or sci-fi book and pop it in the middle, you are more than welcome to, but you absolutely do not have to. So the box next to that is Parallel Universe, and that is a sci-fi subgenre. Apparently I'm having trouble saying S's all of a sudden. Sci-fi subgenre. So this is a type of book in which characters either travel to a parallel universe, so a universe that looks very similar than ours, but something is different. Usually it involves something different happening in history, and the characters travel there and they see what the world would look like if something had or had not happened in history. The hard part with this one is I'm trying to think of books I can use as examples that it's not spoilery to say there's a parallel universe. I guess one of them I was thinking of isn't actually spoilery. 11/22/63 by Stephen King. So this is also a time travel book, so it could count for either one. But the main character goes back in time. I think it's 1957 or 58 he goes back to. And the whole point of the book is he's trying to prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But anytime he changes something in the past, it changes something in the future, which is his present. And so there is a point in the book when he comes back and he sees what the world is like. And so there is a little bit of that parallel universe there. There's another one I'm thinking of, but it's kind of spoilery to say that there's a parallel universe in it, so I'm not going to mention that one. All right, then the next one is dark fantasy. And so dark fantasy is a blend of horror and fantasy. The most obvious example of this that comes to mind is the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. 100% blends fantasy and horror. I feel like the first few books, maybe only one or two books, don't feel as horror-esque to me. Book 6 definitely does. And then there are definitely parts in the other books that still have elements of horror in them. So that's typically what a dark fantasy is you're blending those two genres together. All right, then we'll go down to the fourth row, and the first box is Romantasy, which I will be honest, I have not read. So I don't really have recommendations for this one. I'm pretty sure Fourth Wing is a romantasy, and I've heard about that one enough. We'll go ahead and list that as a recommendation. But basically, like dark fantasy is a blend of horror and fantasy, romantasy is a blend of romance and fantasy. So that one's kind of self-explanatory. The romance is definitely the main part of the story. The fantasy world is just kind of the background for it. Actually, an example I could come up with this that's not quite so new is The Kiss of Deception, which is the first book in the Remnant Chronicles. Because while it's set in a fictional world and there is a gift that the main character has, the fantasy elements, like the magic elements, are so minor and almost non-existent that it's mostly just the fact it takes place in a fictional world that makes this fantasy. And the romance is definitely the bigger part of the story. Then the next box is an epic fantasy, and this is a fantasy in which the decisions the character makes and whether the character succeeds or not affects more than just their small group of people. For the most part, it's going to affect the entire world, but there may be some epic fantasies where it's more so it affects their entire nation, but not the entire world. But basically, there's going to be bigger consequences than just, oh, me and my friends or my family will suffer if I don't succeed. Like, a lot of people are going to suffer if they don't succeed. Again, the most obvious example of this one is The Lord of the Rings. If Frodo doesn't succeed, the entire world is going to be under Sauron's control. So, that is very much an epic fantasy. Alright, the next box is Lost World, and this one is a bit more sci-fi. But for the most part, Lost World is where there is something on Earth that has been lost or forgotten. Atlantis is an obvious example of this. If you have a story that involves finding the lost city of Atlantis, that would be a Lost World story. I can't think of any books off the top of my head that I've read that are Lost World. I can't even think of any books that actually involve Atlantis. I know there's a book I looked up that's technically a Lost World. And if I can find it again, I will pop an image of it up here real quick. But I don't know that many Lost World books. I mean, there is technically The Lost World by Michael Crichton. And depending on the synopsis of that book, that one might count. But that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. Alright, then the next one is high fantasy. And all high fantasy means is it takes place in a fictional world. That's it. So, The Remnant Chronicles, high fantasy. Lord of the Rings, high fantasy. I know people will argue about that, but we're going with its high fantasy. The Dark Tower series, high fantasy. So on and so forth. Most of these that I've mentioned are high fantasy. If it doesn't take place in our world, it takes place in a fictional world, it is high fantasy. But it still has to be fantasy. If it takes place on another planet, that's sci-fi. And we'll get to those. Alright, then the last square on this one is space travel. Like I said, we'll get to those. So, anything that involves a person traveling in space. They could be traveling away from Earth, going somewhere else. This could be where we pick them up in the middle of their travel. It could be that they're traveling from somewhere trying to get back to Earth. Any of those would count. As long as they are traveling in space to get somewhere, it would count. Alright, then going down to the last row, the first box is dystopian. So this is typically going to be a futuristic sci-fi. And it's going to involve a world in which a new society has been created that is basically presented as, this is utopia, this is perfect, this is how we run the world so that everybody is equal and everything is fair. But it really isn't. It's fair for those on top. It is not fair for everybody. So obvious examples, The Hunger Games, Divergent, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, The Handmaid's Tale, the list goes on and on and on. There are a lot of dystopians out there, some of them classics, some of them modern. There are plenty to choose from, I promise. Alright, the next square is anthropomorphic fantasy, which is not an easy word to say. And all that means is that animals are the main characters, and the animals are kind of like humans. So basically the animals can talk, they reason the way humans do. It's a way of telling the story that makes it feel like you're not talking about human beings, even if you are. One of the most obvious examples of this is Redwall by Brian Jacques. The main character is a mouse. We have all sorts of different animals in the books. Mice are the most common, but there are a lot of other animals. Also, the Shady Hollow series, which is a mystery series, that's also anthropomorphic, so any of those would count. Alright, the next square is extraterrestrial. Hello, editing Charlene here, because I completely botched the description of this square. And sorry that my voice sounds weird. My throat has been very dry since last night, and I don't know why, so my voice sounds very scratchy. But the extraterrestrial square is a sci-fi square, and this just means any book that takes place on a planet other than Earth. So some examples of this would be Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, which primarily takes place on Mars. Some other books that would also work are Dune by Frank Herbert and the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. They both take place in another galaxy, on another planet, somewhere far away from where we are. They are fictional galaxies and planets, but that's still supposed to be where they take place. It's not supposed to be a fantasy world, it is supposed to be somewhere else in our universe. So those would still work for this prompt because they are still sci-fi. Alright, the next square is Gaslamp Fantasy, and this is very similar to steampunk. So, steampunk is Victorian era England, in which steam became the main mode of power instead of electricity. But usually there's clockwork and gears and all of this kind of stuff because we're looking at the type of technology people would have invented and all of that. Gaslamp fantasy is Victorian era England, in which steam became the main mode of power instead of electricity, but there's fantastical elements. So it's not focused on all of the clockwork and technology and all of that. There's usually some kind of magic involved as well. So, very similar between the two. Victorian era England, steam power, all of that. But technology and clockwork versus magic. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so those are all the spaces on the bingo board, and hopefully the information I provided earlier explains this well enough. If you'd like a little bit of a challenge to read some more fantasy and sci-fi next year, feel free to join in. And again, you get one entry for every bingo you complete, and an additional entry if you get a blackout. So, again, Google form will be available starting January 1st. And the graphic is down in the description below. So, with all that said, I hope you all are having a wonderful day. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you and give you peace. I'll see you later.